Dr. Lee concludes his series of 6 talks about the problems we humans face in trying to talk sense as he takes a look at the man who knows it all. Dr. Lee.
Suppose you and I, excuse me, were to have a conversation about this very simple item, an apple. Suppose you and I were to talk about it. What are some of the things we might talk about? Well, we might talk about its color, the gradations of color, the size, the weight, the shape, where it came from, what kind it is, what you can do with it, the uses, the particular geometrical shape it has, and so on. And suppose, as we talk, I were to list on the board the individual things we were talking about. And then suppose I had a battery of secretaries and a battery of blackboards, and we wrote on the board all of the things we talked about, all of the uses, the great and tremendous varieties from just plain eating it to distilling it, and all of the other things that we could talk about. This as the apple in song and story, the apple in that very great story. We could talk about the chemistry and the physics. And then suppose as we talked, I kept putting these items on the board. And now I'd like to come to my question. How long would we have to stay here talking about the apple until I could go to the board and draw a great big line and put a period and say, stop. That's all that could be said. Nothing more can be said about this. How long would that take us? When I ask students or audiences sometimes the answer to that question, they reply differently. Some will say forever, a very long time. We never could do it. Some will say, yes, it's possible. We can say all that can be said about this if you leave us alone and let us work on it long enough. That is, there will be a range of replies, but most of the people will tend to say something like this. They will tend to say, no, that isn't all that could be said. There's more. So in order to account for them, let me put a great big ETC and so forth, meaning more could be said. I suppose if I were to have done this little demonstration 50 years ago, or perhaps 100 years ago, the number of people in the audience who would agree with me that we haven't said all there is to be said would be far greater today than it would be then. There were loads of people in the 19th century, for example, who somehow believed, if you leave us alone, we can say all there is to be said. There were some historians, like von Ranke, who was going to write a fully developed history. There were some people in the physical sciences who somehow had come to believe that we had come to the end of what could be said about things. Just one example out of very many others. In 1873, Clerk Maxwell gave a paper to the British Association. Now, the name Clerk Maxwell is one of the brilliant names in the history of physics, and I should just like to read 2 paragraphs from that paper. He said, "No theory of evolution can be formed to account for the similarity of molecules." That is, Maxwell is using the word molecule in pretty much the same sense that we today would use the word atom. He said, "For evolution necessarily implies continuous change, and the molecule is incapable of growth or decay, of generation or destruction. None of the processes of nature from the time when nature began have produced the slightest difference in the properties of any molecule. We are therefore unable to ascribe either the existence of molecules or the identity of their properties to any of the causes which we call natural." Now, please note this sentence. "Thus, we have been led along a strictly scientific path very near to the point at which science must stop. In tracing back the history of matter, science is arrested when she assures herself on the one hand that the molecule has been made, and on the other that it has not been made by any of the processes which we call natural." Now, in 1873, Clerk Maxwell was ready to say that when we have proceeded as far as we can, that's the point at which science must stop. Well, it's interesting that 23 years after the date of Clerk Maxwell's speech, Becquerel observed the radioactivity of uranium. Something was happening to molecules. They did change. They were generated. They were being destroyed. 25 years after Clerk Maxwell, Madame Curie discovered radium. And at the turn of the century, Rutherford and Soddy demonstrated the fact that the radium atom was in a process of rapid disintegration and was itself derived from uranium, whose atoms were disintegrating at a much slower rate. And 70 years later, the word was given to spend $2 billion on the development of a bomb whose theory was that we have not yet come to the end of what we know about the molecule. Nevertheless, it is widely believed today, and I suspect one can get a great deal of agreement, that whenever we talk about anything, probably we will not come to the end of what could be said about it. That when we finish, we perhaps will put a great big comma and et cetera to mean or to imply that more can be said. Now, of course, this isn't anything new. Loads of people have realized this. Thoreau, in his Walden, wrote, "The universe is wider than our views of it." And Walter de la Mare, the poet, wrote, "What we see and hear is only the smallest fraction of what is." And George Santayana wrote, "The most exhaustive account which human science can ever give of anything does not cover all that is true about it." And I even note that William James said, "The word 'and' trails along after every sentence, something always escapes." And to complete this list, to remember that Hamlet at one point turns and says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamed on in our philosophy." So I like the way that wag said it, who, while working on his grapefruit, "There's more in this than meets the eye." That is to say, the world in which we live is a big one. It's full of innumerable details. We talk about the apple, and the number of details and aspects and factors and characteristics that we can talk about, that number is tremendous. I'm almost unwilling to say that it's infinite, but it's tremendous. So that whenever we talk about anything, what must we do, if this is true? If someone were to give a talk about the apple, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 100-minute talk, what would he do? He would select some things to talk about, and he would omit the remainder. Thus, fundamental in the human talking process is that we abstract, we take out of the great number some and omit the remainder. We select some and omit everything that we don't select. And I should like to suggest that this is what talking is like. One can't possibly talk about everything. One can't possibly, I now think, say everything there is to be said about anything. So what does one do? He selects some of the details and omits the remainder. Now, why, if we were to give an assignment, say, to a dozen people to talk about the apple, why, in all probability, would each talk about different aspects of the apple? Well, our psychology friends have all sorts of explanations. You select some things to talk about, you others, based on your conditioning, your experience, your capacity. I think the broad word interest, the things that interest you, are the things which will determine what you select. I saw a bit of a comic bit in the newspaper some time ago under the heading, "When the family buys a car." Father, how many miles to the gallon? Mother, what color is the upholstery? The son, how fast will she go? The daughter, let's see the mirror. And the neighbor, how on earth can they afford it? And as each of us will talk about those details which interest us and omit the others. One more story, if you can bear with me. A student copied this from the Louisville Courier Journal some time ago. It's about a young mother who came to the door of the nursery and saw her husband, a lumber dealer, standing over the baby's crib. Silently, she watched him as he stood looking down at the sleeping infant. In his face, she read rapture, doubt, admiration, ecstasy, incredulity, wonder. Deeply touched, with eyes glistening, she tiptoed to his side and put her arms around his neck. A penny for your thoughts, my dear," she whispered. Startled into consciousness, he blurted, "For the life of me, I don't see how they can make a crib like that for $4." Well, the things that interest some of us are not the things that interest others of us. And I suppose I've merely been trying to say one very small thing, namely, that at the end of anything we say, there is more. That so far as we know, more can be said. Well, what does this mean in everyday life? So what, I suppose, is again the obvious question. What difference does it make that the moment a man starts talking, he talks about what he talks about and he omits the remainder? I should like to discuss some of the varieties of human behavior which take place when people forget this. What happens in the hurry and scuffle of the daily grind when people go about their work unaware of this simple wisdom? And I should like, just as a way of introducing the subject, to ask you, have you ever run onto people who in conversation or argument leave you with the feeling that what they say about anything is all there is to be said about it? Have you ever run onto people in the course of your business or non-business activities who leave you with the feeling, well, I've said it, period, nothing more remains to be said? I want to talk about that attitude, and I want to give it a name. We call it the disease of allness. And by allness, I merely mean the attitude, the manner, the mood, the way of thinking and talking in which a person implies, or sometimes says, that what he knows about anything is all there is to be known about it. And I should like to discuss some of the implications and difficulties that we get into. Now, I very rarely see anybody who comes right out and says, what I know about it is all there is to be known or all there is to be said. I very rarely see it so baldly as in Clarence Day's play, Life with Father. You may remember in Act 2, Scene 1, Father has been wanting a conversation with his eldest son, Clarence, about some man-to-man thing. And they've had some trouble, but finally they're alone, and Father turns and says, Clarence, there are things about women that I think you ought to know. Women aren't the angels that you think they are. You see, Clarence, we men have to run this world. It's not an easy job. It takes work and it takes thinking. Now, you take a woman thinks, nope, I'm wrong right there. A woman doesn't think at all. She gets stirred up, and then she tries to get you stirred up, too. But if you can keep reason and logic in the argument, a man can hold his own, of course. But if they can switch you, pretty soon the argument's about whether you love them or not. I swear I don't know how they do it. But if you watch out and know just how to handle them, you'll be all right. All a man has to do is to be firm. But Clarence, who's been observing things around the Day's household, interrupts and says, yes, Father, but what can you do when they cry? And Father says, well, that's quite a question. You just have to make them understand that what you're doing is for their own good. And now, Clarence, you know all about women. Well, that's Father. Father is much too bald, much too explicit, much too overt. Most of the time, I don't see allness that way. I see allness in much subtler forms. And I should like to discuss at least one of those subtler manifestations of this difficulty. I'd like to talk about it in terms of the problem of unteachability. The problem of human unteachability. Now, I see that. Anybody who ever teaches in a classroom sees it, but I see it particularly in some experience I've had teaching policemen. Now, some of my best friends are policemen, delightful people on the whole once you get to know them. But I almost at this moment can vividly remember, recall some of the first meetings I had with some of the police classes that I've tried to teach. As I enter the room and stand before them, you can almost see the faces in front of you. You can almost see the attitude on their faces as if they were saying to themselves, well, go ahead. Say anything that we haven't heard before. Say anything that we, in our vast and infinite wisdom, don't know about. And may I say, as long as that attitude persists, as long as it prevails, not very much learning takes place. They don't learn very much. That is, they act as if what they now know is all there is to be known. And until somehow the wall of allness has been broken through, not very much acquisition of information or anything else takes place. And may I say, even though I feel that some of the policemen I know are good friends of mine, nevertheless, there are all sorts of things they ought to learn. May I show it this way? Let this circle be, imagine it's a very, very big one. And imagine that in it there are a very, very great number of small circles. And every one of these small circles stands for some aspect of the great subject. Thus, with respect to each of these might be one tiny detail of the apple we could talk about. And thus, whenever I talk, I select some things, and the remaining are omitted. Now, these policemen know a very great deal about their job. But so long as they come to feel that what they know about it is all there is to be known about it, as I say, not very much learning takes place. And the first task, from one point of view, of the teacher or the educational process is to break through that wall of allness so that reception, retentivity becomes possible. May I tell you about this phenomenon in another way in terms of some reading experiments that we've been doing. Now, these aren't revolutionary or earth-shattering. They have been very indicative for us of some very interesting things. We've been working with a very small school where at the end of the first semester, teachers have come to realize that individuals in this school don't seem to read fast enough. They don't seem able to absorb the amount of reading they have in their college classes. And we've had those students taken out and put in an experimental group. one wonders why reading difficulties carry on into the university, but then the moment one realizes the size of classes that teachers have to put up with in the lower grades, it isn't surprising that youngsters don't get to learn to read. Teaching of reading, as well as other things, is a remarkably personal process, and it's awfully difficult to get personal with a crowded classroom. But to come on back to my experiment. These youngsters who seem unable to read, according to their teachers, are put in a group. And the very first thing we do when we get them is to send them off to an education clinic, a reading clinic, to see if anything's wrong with their eyes. And immediately, about 20% of those students are released because they do need glasses or they do need corrective mechanical work with their eyes. The remaining come back. We give them a number of tests, and I have no time to describe all of the tests, but I should like to describe just one little bit of one of them. One of the tests consists, it's really not a test, it's a little game. It's a letter 3 pages long that Thomas Jefferson once wrote to a friend of his. And in the letter, Jefferson is arguing the values of the democratic process, the values of a good deal of education. He's saying only in a free democratic community in which everybody has an opportunity to get an education can we discover whether people have the capacity or not. And he goes on tying up the great agrarian development in this country with the necessity of great education and so on. We give this 3-page letter to which, or in which, I have made one small addition. I've added the following, which Thomas Jefferson never did write. And the following is this. And anybody who really believes that I, Thomas Jefferson, am in favor of a democratic society misunderstands me completely, because I think most people are too dumb to learn, most people shouldn't be taught anyway, most people need to be pushed around by the rest of us. Period. I just insert that about midway on page 3 and ask the students, please read this whole letter carefully and come back tomorrow. Our instructions are, please read this carefully. When they return tomorrow, we give them a quiz on the letter. The quiz is very simple, and I just ask you to think of question number 6. Question number 6 is this. At any point in this letter, did Mr. Jefferson have any doubts about the democratic process? Did he think it might not work? Did he indicate that he was opposed to it? 79, almost 80% of all the students we've studied, something like 250 now, say no to question 6. Now, why do they say no? We then assign each of these students to a clinical psychologist for conversation. And they sit down with one objective. Why did you give the answer you did to question number 6, along with a lot of other things? And they may sit for 2 hours, 6 hours, 8, 10, 12 hours, until we find out, or until we get some information. Now, so far, the thing that is most fascinating from my point of view is this. In these conversations, almost 2 out of 3, that is, it's 64% of all of these students, proceed ultimately in the conversation to break down and say something like this. Well, okay, so I didn't read it. And then when the probing goes on, we're astonished to discover that it isn't that these students can't read, it is simply that they don't. And why don't they? Well, as they say it, freedom, agrarianism, democracy, that stuff, that's old stuff. Everybody knows that. And we now have come to wonder whether it is correct to say that these people can't read or simply that they don't. And why don't they? Well, if I'd come to believe that I already know what's on the sheet, why do I bother to look at it? And thus, for us, the problem in helping youngsters to read may well become part of the greater process of teaching youngsters to be teachable. We've done the same thing with truck drivers and office people in a number of large corporations in Chicago. We did the same thing with the truck drivers who had to listen to safety talks and demonstrations and movies about once a week. We interviewed them at great length in an attempt to find out what they got from these educational sessions. And we were astonished over and over. They seemed to listen, but they never heard. When we asked them about what they saw, they seemed not to be able to know the details. They didn't remember them. And then when we asked them why not, in these interview situations, over and over they would say something like, oh, this speeding safety, everybody knows that. And thus, for us, the first step somehow in the achievement of that sense of teachability, how to become sensitive to the greatness and vastness of what there is, it seems to us that involves helping people to remember the et cetera. A homely illustration. A farmer doesn't take a handful of seed and throw them into an open field and expect that they'll take root. No. First, he prepares the soil. He breaks it up. He conditions the soil for the reception of the seed. We now have come to believe that youngsters and oldsters too, perhaps, need preparing, conditioning for more reception. I wish I could describe how many of our habits of talking somehow lead to a feeling that what I've said is all there is to be said. Think, for example, when we call people things. We say, he's a slow student, period. Or that man is a criminal, period. Note the implications of that's what he is and that's all he is. Or in the illustration I gave in the previous session, General Patton says, he's a coward. And that's all he is. And it is that implication and that's all he is that we think is the first step towards the imprisonment of the human mind. And if we could do anything to create a sensitivity that there is more, we might somehow reduce the arrogance and the intransigence that comes when people talk together. Several years ago, at a conference on science, philosophy, and religion at Columbia, a spokesman for a particular group arose and bluntly said this. The conference had been discussing problems for 2 or 3 days, and the spokesman arose and said, we knew what we believed before we came here. These talks haven't changed our beliefs. Even if you prove we're wrong, which I don't think you can do, we'll still leave believing the same things we did when we came in the door. Now, how much learning took place? What happened in this particular moment? What went on to enrich the outlook and the perceptions of the individual? It's very difficult to talk about this thing called allness because it isn't anything solid that you can point to. It's an attitude. It's a point of view. And perhaps I can do nothing more than indicate the directions that point of view takes. We see it in loads of ways. We see it in an adult who will cut off a youngster trying to make an explanation. We'll see it in a teacher who acts as if what she says brooks no further questioning. And incidentally, we've come to feel that teachers and supervisors and officers ought to be very wary of the allness in their talking because of something very interesting that happens. Let this be a teacher or a parent, and this be the student, or let this be an officer and an enlisted man, or a non-commissioned officer and an enlisted man. If this person radiates allness, it just doesn't vanish into the air. If you are at the end of the receiving of allness talk, you don't just stop, you freeze up too. We've observed that employees in an office, when a supervisor is full of arrogance and allness, it comes back. It radiates and it reverberates. And the first thing you know, the reverberation is so great that the wall that separates man from man gets built up. And thus, when allness exists, there also exists tension. And there exists also these things which tend to prevent the development and growth of the individual. Well, there are many ways, of course, of describing this, and there are many other ways of indicating the implications and applications of this. I think I should just want to say one or two more things. Namely, America, the United States, has been for 150 years a growing, developing, continuously expanding kind of society. There is some indication that we are getting older. There will be more old people in our society than ever before. There's some reason to believe that as we get older, we get a little more rigid. We get a little more unteachable. We get to feel a little more this sense of arrogance. And arrogant people tend not to grow. They tend not to be willing to adventure. They tend not to be willing to keep on going to try something again. Because it's much easier to say, it won't work. We know it can't be done. We know it. And in that mood, the mood that says we know it, that's the mood in which it is very difficult to have growth. And growth, it seems to me, in the kind of complicated world in which we live, is something desperately needed. We've interviewed hundreds of people in offices to ask them, what are the personality manifestations which cause you most difficulty in your daily work? And they don't use our words. They don't talk about allness and arrogance and so on. They don't talk about omitting details, but they do talk about these tremendously varied demonstrations in which people are hard to live with. Now, am I saying that if you adopt the attitude of allness, that means we don't believe anything? We don't have strong beliefs, strong faith? Not at all. We believe what we believe. We know what we know. We're aware of what we're aware. But that isn't all. The difference between a man who is aware of the et cetera and the man who isn't is the difference between the growing man and the bigot. It is the bigot who acts as if what he knows is all there is to be known. And it seems to some of us that a world in which there is a little less bigotry and a little more growth is a happier world in which to live. May I close this by reading you a parable that was originally written by William Saroyan and rewritten by Carl Sandburg. It's a parable about a fellow who gets to pawing around a second-hand store and picks up an old cello with one string to it. He takes it home, sits in a corner of his front room, finds a place for his one finger to hold down that one string. Then he saws back and forth with a bow. Hours on hours every day, his patient wife has to listen to him sawing back and forth on that one string and his one finger always on that one place. Weeks pass, and she notices he never once changes his finger from that one place as he saws and saws back and forth on that one string. Sometimes she went so far as to wish he would drop dead and his one finger be loose from the one place where he always held it on the one string. Other times she hoped and prayed he would suddenly realize what he was doing and stand up and smash the cello and throw away the bow, but this didn't happen. He went on playing. You see, he had taught her to speak softly or else. So one day she said softly to him she'd watched other players playing the cello, and she went on. They always had four strings to the cello, and more than that, they kept changing their fingers from one place to another all the time they were playing. This, she went on, she'd particularly seen. They never kept one finger in the same place on the one string while playing the cello. He looked at her a slow moment. He laid down his bow and cello. He told her, I might have expected this from you. You're a woman. Your hair is long, your understanding short. Of course, the other cello players are always moving their fingers from one place to another. They're looking for the right place. I found it. Now, I should not have wanted you to believe that the general semanticist has an exclusive monopoly on all wisdom. In these sessions, I've been trying to describe some of the things which lead to trouble when people talk together. I've described the difficulties that come when people jump to conclusions, the difficulties that come when people act as poor observers, the difficulties that come when we oversimplify, the difficulties that come when people act as if what other people say they mean as if I were talking and I were meaning. And today, in this session, I've been talking about some of the difficulties that come when people act as if they know it all. I trust that this adventure moves in some new direction.
Dr. Irving J. Lee, professor of public speech at Northwestern University, has just completed the last of his 6 talks on the subject of talking sense.